On December 1, 2014, 47-year-old Ebola Ryan, a mother of 3, eagerly anticipated spending the holiday season with her children. Unfortunately, someone disrupted her plans, preventing her from enjoying her favorite time of year with her family. Just 3 days after her murder, on December 4, 2014, the Abu Dhabi Police Department concluded their relentless investigation into the brutal homicide by making an arrest in the city. The details that emerged following the arrest prompted authorities to heighten their vigilance, as an unexpected motive was revealed, indicating that the case was more complex than initially believed. Who was the woman taken into custody by the Abu Dhabi police? What could she have done that put the investigators in a race against time? The woman who was arrested was 38-year-old Alabadr Abdullah al-Hashemi. She was a Yemeni-born woman living in the United Arab Emirates with her husband, Mohammed al-Habashi al-Hashemi, and their 6 children. Allah's eldest child was 10 years old, while her youngest was merely 10 months old when she decided to commit an awful deed. All her kids, young and innocent, were unaware of the wicked schemes that went on inside their mother's head. On Monday, December 1, 2014, Allah set out to bring her plans into action. She put her black gloves on and covered her face with a veiled niqabi, a usually black garment worn by Muslim women to cover their face as part of an interpretation of hijab. Leaving her house just a little before 1 p.m. that same day, Allah headed to the famous boutique mall, which was located on Al Reem Island in Abu Dhabi. Despite knowing that the mall was equipped with fully functioning CCTV cameras and that she was being watched by the security, Allah was completely unbothered. She wouldn't turn back or leave the mall without doing what she had to do. Allah entered the mall around 1:13 p.m. and took the elevator. Upon exiting the elevator, Allah spoke briefly to a security guard and then headed towards the mall's washroom, where she encountered a 47-year-old woman named Ebola Ryan. Allah waited for a while, and when Ebola was alone, Allah struck with full force and stabbed her to death. Moments later, after exiting the washroom, Allah rushed to the lobby once again and hurriedly got into the elevator. It didn't take long for the crowd in the mall to notice what had happened inside the washroom, and as they emerged in the lobby in a state of panic, still processing the gruesome murder that had just taken place, Ella escaped the building. And even though the security at Boutique Mall was usually tight, Ella managed to slip through the hands of the guards. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Luckily, all her movements had been captured by the security footage. The mall security informed the Abu Dhabi Police Department of the tragic incident, and as the detectives arrived at the scene, an investigation was launched into the murder. Ebola Ryan was a Hungarian-American kindergarten teacher who was originally born and brought up in Romania. In 2006, she and her husband Paul Ryan relocated to Sopron, Hungary along with their daughter Tamaya and twin sons, Adam and Aiden, before subsequently undergoing a divorce. After she had separated from her husband, Ebola went wherever her work took her. Over the course of the next few years, Ebola had a diverse teaching career which spanned 4 countries, including the United States, and with Abu Dhabi being her last stop. She had been residing in Abu Dhabi for almost a year, and apart from being a teacher there, she also fulfilled the duties of being a devoted mother to her 11-year-old twin sons who lived with her in their Abu Dhabi home. At the time, Ebola's 13-year-old daughter, Tamaya, was living with her father, Paul, Ebola's ex-husband in Vienna, Austria. Ebola had devoted herself to the realm of education in the United Arab Emirates. And even though she was in a strange land away from home, she settled in quite well. Beyond the conventional scope of her teaching responsibilities, she also undertook the role of mentoring fellow teachers, contributing significantly to the professional growth of her peers. It was also evident through her actions that her main focus was to lead her students toward a better future, and she was widely recognized for her resolute dedication to her profession. Ebola embodied a sense of purity in this world, serving as a beacon of kindness and compassion. She lived with a profound sense of purpose, consistently striving to create a positive impact and contribute to the betterment of the lives she touched. On December 1, 2014, as the holiday season was approaching, Ebola had planned to go shopping at the boutique mall and then head home to her twins. But little did she know that fate had different plans for her. During the initial stages of the investigation, authorities faced considerable difficulty in ascertaining the identity of the suspect, who remained completely concealed from head to toe. This also led them to consider the possibility that the perpetrator might be a male masquerading in disguise. A couple of days after the tragic murder of Ebola, specifically on December 3, 2014, Abu Dhabi police issued a public statement indicating that efforts were still underway to determine the identity and gender of the suspect. And although there were many people who saw the killer, none of them could provide any distinctive details such as facial features or build about the suspect because of the fully enveloping attire, consisting with a booyah, black gloves, and a face cover. The Abu Dhabi Security Media Department further shared more information by uploading a video on its official YouTube channel. This footage, featuring CCTV recordings, portrayed the killer labeled as the Reem Island Ghost. The video showcased the reactions of the people present at the scene during the heinous act. Notably, a mother accompanied by a young child was observed hastily ushering the child away, while security personnel approached the corridor in response to the unfolding events. The footage showed heightened awareness around onlookers, with particular attention drawn to activities in the restroom area. The surveillance footage, serving as a critical piece of evidence, also captured the cloaked suspect subsequently picking up a newspaper, probably to conceal the weapon, and then proceeding in the direction of the restroom. Approximately 90 minutes later, the individual suspected of the assault hastily re-emerged into the lobby, prompting disarray among shoppers who swiftly dispersed. In the midst of the chaotic scene, the alleged attacker dismissed the efforts of a woman attempting to interfere with her. As a security guard made his way towards the restrooms, the suspect rushed into the elevator and ultimately fled the scene after the crime occurred. The tape concluded by revealing a distressing visual. A trail of bloody footprints originating from one of the restroom stalls gave a glimpse of the violent and gruesome nature of the crime. Law enforcement officials reported that the unfortunate victim, Ebola, met a tragic end through fatal stabbing. Detectives also discovered a kitchen knife at the crime scene and confirmed that it was the murder weapon. Questioning the witnesses, the detectives learned that prior to the murder, the two women had also gotten into a heated argument. But it wasn't clear to any of the detectives whether the attack on Ebola was planned or was it just the result of an overly heated argument. The surveillance footage, as well as the official police reports, provided a detailed account of the suspect. Following the commission of the initial crime, the Niqabi suspect was seen returning to her vehicle and eventually exiting the scene. Shockingly, detectives learned that the suspect had then proceeded to a residential building situated in the Abu Dhabi Corniche, where once again, an unsettling sequence of events unfolded. The security cameras at this location captured the suspect's movement and showed her walking into the building holding a small black suitcase. She proceeded toward the apartment of a 46-year-old Egyptian-American doctor who was only identified as MH. The doctor lived there with his wife and 3 kids. She left the suitcase near their residence and exited the building. Compellingly, the police video revealed more details about the suspect. In the video, detectives were able to see the presence of blood on the suspect's steering wheel and the black suitcase, identical to the one she allegedly carried to the doctor's apartment. This chilling visual evidence added another layer of complexity to the unfolding narrative, highlighting the gravity of the suspect's actions as she went from one crime scene to the next. Fortunately, the doctor's son spotted the suitcase in the evening while going to the mosque to pray. He saw something strange in front of the house and told his family. They called a security guard for help and he contacted the police. The police were able to confirm that it was a bomb and defuse it just in time before it could explode. The security guard mentioned that a woman with gloves had come to the house just minutes before the incident. She was dragging a black suitcase. He added that she went to the floor where the doctor's family lived, and a few minutes later, quickly left the building. According to detectives, the homemade bomb was made using basic materials which were easily available in the market. The bomb was made up of a small gas cylinder, a lighter, glue, and nails meant to cause severe injuries when the bomb went off. While the detectives kept the investigation going to identify the killer, they kept their progress and measures under wraps, not sharing many details about the case. On the morning of Thursday, December 4, 2014, Abu Dhabi police caught the person responsible for the crime. The killer was identified as 38-year-old Ala Badr Abdullah al-Hashami. General Sheikh Saif bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who is Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Interior in the UAE, shared that the security and police forces had arrested the suspected woman known as Nikki Bai for brutally killing the American teacher, Ebola Ryan. He highlighted that they identified the suspect in less than 24 hours and arrested her in less than 48 hours. However, the detectives refused to disclose how they successfully identified Ala. Going through Ala's internet search history, it was evident that Ala had become extreme in her beliefs because of the things she saw on the internet and the people she followed. She didn't have a specific plan to hurt a particular American person, but she wanted to hurt someone from another country at random. Ala was quite blunt when she stated the reason behind the attacks and didn't try to hide any details. Ala admitted that she chose Ebola and the doctor simply because they were American. Furthermore, Ala told the detectives in charge of the case that she committed those horrible acts because her husband, Mohammed al-Habashi al-Hashemi, was taken by the police for questioning on the suspicion that he might be connected to terrorist groups. She wanted to get back at the police force for taking her husband and make foreigners, especially Americans, British, and French people living in the country, scared for their safety. These terrible incidents happened after there were other attacks on people from Western countries and Saudi Arabia. Many people around the world heard about these attacks, and it made the international security and business communities worried. Additionally, just a few weeks from Ebola's stabbing, there had been warnings from U.S. embassies in the area because some websites were encouraging attacks specifically on American teachers. Abu Dhabi was mostly considered a safe place for people from other countries to work, and the security there was very strict when it came to terrorism. However, in light of these events, people from other countries living in Abu Dhabi began to grow fearful regarding the increasing crime rate against international citizens. The government in the Emirates said that Ebola's killing was a terrorist attack done by one person who had been influenced by online terrorist beliefs. The police clarified that Ala didn't know either of her victims. She carried out those attacks only because of the nationality of the victims and not because of any personal problems. This made the people who live in Abu Dhabi, both citizens and those from other countries, feel uneasy because terrorist attacks almost never happen in the United Arab Emirates. Detectives uncovered another threatening detail about Ebonia's murder when they came across a statement made in September 2014 by Abu Muhammad al-Adani, who spoke for the group calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. In the statement, Abu Muhammad al-Adani urged the Muslim community to harm Westerners and people from any other country involved in the attacks on their group. His exact words were, "Hurt them in any way you can." The attacks that followed this threatening statement were seen as part of a pattern of violent acts inspired by ideas instead of a direct order from militant groups. Other examples included the 2014 ramming attack in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, the beheading of a French tourist named Hervé Gourdel in Algeria, and other attacks on people from Denmark and the United States in Saudi Arabia. Events of terrorism were not taken lightly by the officials in Abu Dhabi. A good chunk of the city's functioning relied on the work of many people from other countries and on tourism to keep its economy going. To make sure that the violence remained isolated, security authorities sent out a strong message to any other potential terrorists in the UAE, warning them of the dangerous outcomes of any attacks they might be planning. A security official in the UAE, who wasn't named, shared with an Emirates news agency called WAM that just before the attack, Ala had been surfing through terrorist websites on the internet, and it was through these websites that she learned how to make explosives and carry out a murder. The detectives were also keen on exploring the possibility that Ala was not working alone. The police talked to ABC News and said they arrested some other people at Ala's house, but they weren't certain whether these people were involved in the attack or not. Ala told the investigators that her husband, Mohammed al-Habashi al-Hashemi, used to support militant groups. He made her watch and listen to recordings of leaders from groups like Osama bin Laden. Her house was said to be like a base of operations, but it wasn't clear if she was part of any groups. Upon further investigation, it was discovered that Ala was also found guilty of using an online account to share information that mocked and harmed the country. As the news channels covered the report of Ala's arrest, it was revealed that she was also convicted of sending money to Al-Qaeda, a terrorist organization in Yemen, knowing that it would be used to support terrorist activities. On June 29, 2015, before announcing the verdict, Judge Fallah al-Hajari said that the UAE, with Allah's blessings, had been and always will continue to be a safe and stable place. It's an example of people living together in peace and harmony. He mentioned that in recent years, some new criminal methods not seen before in the UAE have been used to scare and hurt people. The goal was to disrupt the country's system and put society in danger by doing harmful things. When there was a threat to the overall stability of the nation, it was important to review and deal with these actions in the strictest way possible. That's why the new anti-terror law was achieved to fight against terrorism and get rid of it. The judge ordered the law enforcement to confiscate all the evidence in Allah's case and to shut down the online account Allah had been using to communicate with terrorist organizations. Later, on June 29, 2015, the Federal Supreme Court in Abu Dhabi sentenced 38-year-old Emirati woman, Ala Badir al-Hashimi, to death for committing the murder of 47-year-old Ebola Ryan. Since the ruling was made by the Supreme Court, it could not be appealed. Hence, Ala's fate had been decided. During her trial, Ala requested the court to provide her with psychological help. She said that she had been having strange visions and saw ghost-like people. The court took this into consideration and called for psychiatric tests to be done on Ala. However, the results showed that Ala was well aware of what she did, and her mental state didn't seem to affect her actions when she carried them out. When the court declared the verdict and sentence, Ala, surrounded by 4 police officers, didn't show any emotion. After leaving the court, she smiled and waved at her father and brother. On July 13, 2015, a Monday morning, Ahmed Al-Dahani, Attorney General for the State Security Prosecution, announced that the ruling of the State Security Circuit of the Federal Supreme Court No. 73 of 2015 on the execution of Ala Badr Abdullah had been carried out following the approval of President Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan. However, the officials didn't disclose how Ala was executed. Members of the expatriate community in Dubai held a candlelight vigil in memory of Ebola Ryan and shared how her tragic death had impacted them. The process of closure for Ebola's family, friends, and the teaching community was difficult. Paul Ryan, Ebola's former husband with whom she had 3 children, shared his views on the verdict as well. A recruitment firm that helped bring Paul Ryan to Abu Dhabi started a fundraising campaign so he could take her body back home and support their children's education. After a few weeks, the Ryan family took over the fund and utilized it to help Ryan's family in Romania. General Sheikh Saif talked about Ebola's murder as something that went against the important values the UAE believed in. These values came from the teachings of Islam and the true Arab heritage. He mentioned that the UAE strongly supported these good values, whether it was within the country or in other places. He also shared how sad he felt to see such crimes happening in a country known for its safety and security. Later in 2015, Ala's husband, Mohammed al-Habashi al-Hashemi, faced serious charges for supposedly planning to bomb tourist places and harm a local leader in December of that same year. The name of the leader Mohammed had planned to assassinate wasn't revealed. During a court hearing at the Federal Supreme Court, Mohammed persisted that he was innocent and said he didn't do any of the things he was accused of. Mohammed was being represented by 2 lawyers. One was chosen by the government, and the other was chosen by his family. Both lawyers dodged reporters when asked to make a comment on Mohammed's situation. Mohammed was accused of 7 things, including planning to bomb the Yas Marina Formula 1 racetrack and a nearby IKEA in the capital. He also supposedly planned to attack tourists and an American military base. Police also found evidence linking Mohammed to terrorist organizations Al-Qaeda and ISIS. His case was adjourned until January 18, 2016. But since it didn't receive enough media coverage, the public couldn't find out how the court proceedings went and what the verdict was. Do you think if it hadn't been for the detectives' quick actions leading to Ala's timely arrest, Ala would have committed even more terrorist acts? During her trial, Ala didn't have any form of guilt or remorse for her actions. Do you think this was because she had been brainwashed by terrorist groups? Teresa Scalf was an incredibly loving person. She turned that trait into a career, becoming a nurse and ultimately inspiring the majority of her family to also work in healthcare. In 1986, Teresa was 29 years old and working at Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center in Lakeland, Florida. She lived in an apartment with her 8-year-old son. On October 27, 1986, Teresa's mother, Betty, received a phone call telling her that Teresa had not shown up for her shift at the hospital. Concerned, Betty drove over to her daughter's apartment around 10:30 p.m. Teresa did not answer the door, so Betty used a credit card to manipulate the lock on the door and get inside. When she got inside, Betty discovered a bloody scene and her daughter's lifeless body. Fortunately, Teresa's young son was not at home. Teresa had been stabbed to death and nearly decapitated as a result of the depth of the wounds to her neck. She also had defensive wounds showing that she had fought back against her killer. While Teresa's fight to survive did not save her life, it would ultimately identify her killer. Teresa's case did go cold, but police did not give up on it, even after decades. Cold case detective Matthew Newbold was assigned to the case in 2020. Cold case detective Matthew Newbold was assigned to the case in 2015. He kept Teresa's picture in his office and promised her sister Pam that he would not retire until he solved the case. He was able to uphold that promise. On October 16, 2023, Polk County Sheriff Grady Judd announced that Detective Newbold had identified Teresa's killer as Donald Douglas. Douglas had been 33 years old at the time of the murder and had lived directly behind Teresa's apartment. He had been interviewed as a part of the routine canvass of Teresa's apartment complex but had never been a person of interest in the case. He could not be arrested for the murder because he died of natural causes at the age of 54. He had never been arrested for anything during his lifetime. 2 types of blood had been identified from the crime scene, Teresa's and her killer's, because she had fought against him hard enough to make him bleed. DNA was extracted from that blood sample and run through the combined DNA index system sometime in the early 2000s, but no match had been found. Detective Newbold began working with Othram Inc. in 2022 to trace the unknown DNA through commercial DNA databases. Extensive genealogical work revealed that a third cousin of the killer had an identification of Douglas as a potential suspect. His remains have been cremated following his death, so Detective Newbold had no way to obtain a direct DNA sample from him or his body. Douglas did have a son, and Detective Newbold contacted him. The son was certain that his father could not have killed anyone, but was still fully cooperative with the investigation and provided a sample of his DNA. Analysis confirmed the biological relationship 80 to see her daughter's killer identified. "I'm 84 years old. I lived to see this done. I think that's why I lived so long," she said following the identification of Douglas. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. In 1981, 14-year-old Karen Alexander and her 13-year-old brother Gordon lived in the College Hill neighborhood of Texarkana, Arkansas with their parents and were members of Trinity Baptist Church. Karen was an 8th grader at College Hill Junior High School. She was a well-behaved student who loved spelling and English. She wanted to be a nurse when she grew up. Karen was very soft-spoken but was incredibly kind and sweet to those she did talk to. She did not like to draw a lot of attention to herself but had a few close friends. She enjoyed trading stickers and having sleepovers with them. Gordon was far more extroverted than his older sister. The 6th grade student at Washington Middle School had a gentle but outgoing spirit. He always had a smile on his face and said good morning to everyone at school. He was not simply loud, talking just for the sake of talking, but genuinely kind to everyone around him. He gave compliments freely to and made an effort to get to know everyone he met. Gordon had dreams of one day playing football despite a lifetime of health problems. These health concerns and their effects, like a special shoe he had to wear to account for a difference between the length of his legs, sometimes made him a target for bullies, but their actions did not tarnish his spirit. Gordon had been born with a congenital heart defect that required him to undergo open heart surgery as an infant. Later in his life, he suffered a stroke, which resulted in the left side of his body being weakened. In April of 1981, Gordon was confined to a wheelchair. He had broken his hip approximately 3 months earlier when he fell off his bicycle and was undergoing physical therapy. He and Karen spent the night of April 7th alone at home. Their mother, Vera, had been admitted to Wadley Hospital the previous weekend as a mental health patient. Their father, Weldon, worked the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. at a local tire factory, Cooper Tire. Weldon called police at 7:15 a.m. on April 8th, telling them that he had come home from work to find his front door open and his 2 children having been attacked. His son was dead in the kitchen, and his daughter was on her bed near the living room, potentially still alive but seriously injured. When police officers arrived 9 minutes later, Weldon told them that he had pulled a dull knife from Karen's body and placed it on a nearby bookshelf. Gordon had sustained 16 stab wounds and was deceased, but Karen was still clinging to life despite the fact that she had been beaten, strangled, and stabbed several times in the face. It would later be determined that she had been raped. She was taken to St. Michael Hospital, where she remained in a coma until she died 3 days later. Her autopsy concluded that her cause of death was a stab wound to her right eye that struck her brain. The Texarkana police created a special investigative team to work the case, and they worked around the clock. All days off have been canceled. We will work full-time until this case is solved. The person who did this is an animal. We hope the courts will treat them as they would a mad dog, Texarkana Police Detective Jimmy Cowart said at the time. However, the case went cold despite their efforts. Henry Lee Lucas would later claim responsibility for the murders, but his confession, like almost all of the hundreds of confessions he made to garner attention and special treatment from law enforcement, was proven to be a lie. Gordon and Karen's mother, Vera, took her own life just 3 years after her children were killed at the age of 37. Calvin Seward was a patrolman with the Texarkana Police Department who was assigned to the Alexander investigation shortly after the murders occurred. The case was a difficult one for him as he had children the same age as Karen and Gordon, including a daughter who was one of Karen's classmates. Officer Seward was promoted to sergeant and then captain with the department before he retired from it in 2004. He went on to work with the U.S. Marshals and the Texarkana Airport Police for another 18 years before retiring again, conducted numerous interviews, and reviewed several pieces of forensic evidence. He then began working with forensic criminologist Dr. Todd Steffi as well as Kelly Dixon, a DNA scientist at the Arkansas State Crime Lab. DNA testing had last been done on the evidence from the Alexander case in 2012, and the three of them agreed that the evidence should be retested based on advancements made in the field since then. DNA was found under both Gordon and Karen's fingernails, which had been preserved. DNA was also found in semen on Karen's bedsheets. This DNA was compared to Karen and Weldon Alexander being his children's killer. Trace evidence was found on Karen's body and in dried blood on Gordon's hands. It contained fibers, brass, copper, and zinc, all of which Weldon Alexander would have been exposed to at work at a tire manufacturer. Police had initially believed that the children had been killed while their father was at his overnight shift. However, Captain Seward's investigation revealed that this timeline was incorrect. He learned from the officer who first responded to the scene that Gordon's body had been cold to the touch when he arrived. Police had also originally believed that Karen and Gordon had let their killer inside and had been visiting with them before they were killed. There had been no signs of forced entry, and Police Captain Jimmy Cowart stated that he believed Karen had changed out of her nightgown and into a pair of shorts and a shirt because someone had come to the house after she had gone to bed. It was determined that Karen and Gordon had, in fact, been found in the clothes they had been wearing the previous day. Knowing all this, Captain Seward now believed that Weldon Alexander had attacked his children prior to leaving for work and called police pretending he found them like that when he returned from his overnight shift. It appeared that when Weldon began raping his daughter, Karen, his son Gordon, despite being in a wheelchair, tried to protect her and was killed for his bravery. Weldon Alexander had died on November 6, 2014 at the age of 80 and, as such, could not be arrested for killing his own children. However, Captain Seward and Dr. Steffi still submitted an affidavit of probable cause to the Miller County prosecuting attorney, naming him as the most probable suspect in the case. In a letter dated October 11, 2023, Miller County prosecuting attorney Connie Mitchell stated, "After reviewing your comprehensive report and meeting with you personally to discuss the case, your findings, and theories, it is my opinion that Weldon Alexander, father to Karen Alexander and Gordon Alexander, is the sole viable suspect in their murder. I believe probable cause exists for the issuance of a warrant for 2 counts of capital murder. While this warrant could not be issued, finally having answers in the case will hopefully be beneficial to those who loved Karen and Gordon and never gave up on solving their murders. At the press conference announcing the resolution of the investigation, Police Chief Michael Cram stated, "It is our hope that the friends and remaining family of Gordon and Karen Alexander may find some peace in knowing that scientific and circumstantial evidence has been revealed sufficient to resolve this 42-year-old case." Ellie was born on February 6, 2002, to parents Carol and Matthew Gould, both in their late 40s. As a Year 12 student at Hardin Hewitt School, she approached her A-levels with ambition evident in her eyes. However, Ellie was more than just a diligent student. She found solace in the open fields while riding her cherished horse. She had a natural talent for it and even dreamed of joining the mounted police. Beyond trophies and achievements, Ellie played a vital role in her family's life. Her peers recognized her as a true friend, someone who would listen to your deepest secrets and make you laugh until your sides ached. Ellie was not only wonderful with her friends, but also with her cousins. One of her closest cousins was 17-year-old Jess Vine. They were inseparable. She also wanted to study psychology. Those A-levels were stepping stones to understanding the complexities of the human mind, the good, the bad, and the fascinating gray areas in between. She wanted to help people, see what made them tick, and make the world a little brighter. But life took an unexpected turn for Ellie. No one could have fathomed the gruesome way she was taken away. On May 3, 2019, Ellie Gould chose to study at home for her A-levels instead of going to school. But this day turned out to be different. When her dad, Matthew Gould, came back from work, everything changed. The usual routine and laughter disappeared, replaced by a silence that lingered in the house forever. Matthew, Ellie's dad, panicked and called for the ambulance. In a state of shock, he then reached out to Carol, Ellie's mother, not knowing what to do next or how to handle what he had just witnessed. His once vibrant daughter now lay on the floor, eyes open and emotionless, her lovely face scarred, and her laugh gone. The Wiltshire police investigation revealed that Ellie had been lying lifeless in her kitchen for at least 4 hours. Shockingly, she had suffered 13 separate stab wounds to her neck and showed signs of strangulation. The manner of the stabbing was so aggressive and disturbing that even the best surgeons or any form of first aid wouldn't have been able to save her. It was a tragic and horrifying situation beyond help. The police quickly concluded that Ellie couldn't have done this to herself, and the chance of a stranger being responsible was very slim. Everything in the house remained undisturbed, leading them to believe it wasn't an outsider. The police were baffled as the evidence suggested that it wasn't an outsider. They started exploring closer circles, family, friends, or someone known to Ellie. The motive remained a mystery, making this case even more complicated. Her parents, still bewildered, initially considered the possibility that Ellie may have fallen accidentally from a chair or may have caused harm to herself unknowingly. However, Matthew, her father, paused and reconsidered the entire scene. Perhaps he sensed that something was amiss or realized that there might be more to the situation than initially thought. The breakthrough came when a neighbor provided a crucial lead. They had seen a slim, unidentified male visitor in Ellie's house earlier that day. Though they didn't catch a glimpse of the person's face, this description became the focus of the police investigation. The hunt for this mysterious young man began, marking a significant turn in the case. As soon as they caught wind of this lead, Diaz Jim Taylor, the investigator, and his team swiftly moved to interview all of Ellie's friends. They started with Ellie Welling, a 17-year-old classmate and friend of Ellie Gould. Ellie Welling was supposed to pick Ellie Gould up on the day of her tragic death, May 3, 2019. After conversing with Ellie's friends, the police hit a dead end. However, their attention was drawn to an unusual vehicle that was seen approaching Ellie's residence. This car was out of place in the neighborhood and showed up on surveillance cameras shortly after Ellie's demise. Now, to push the investigation ahead, the police needed Ellie's parents to point to anyone they suspected among her friends. But because Ellie's parents were familiar with all her friends, they couldn't think of anyone right away. Then the police directly asked if Ellie had a romantic relationship, and that's when it clicked for Ellie's parents. They mentioned 18-year-old Thomas Griffiths. Thomas Griffiths, an 18-year-old A-level student, served as a rugby player for the premier team and held the esteemed position of a prefect at Harden Hoy School in Chappenham, Wiltshire. He came from a respectable family and was also someone who worked hard to earn the prospects of having a bright future ahead of him. Ellie knew him since the 7th grade and had a huge crush on him. So undoubtedly, she was very excited when they finally entered into a relationship. They officially started dating in January 2019, and their connection flowed smoothly, marking Thomas as Ellie's first boyfriend. Ellie's parents were well informed about every aspect of her life, so inevitably, she confided in her mom about Griffith. While her parents wished she'd prioritize her studies over boys, they also understood the fragility of teenage love, something they aimed to navigate carefully. Despite their preference for her focus on schooling, they agreed to let her date. However, they insisted on meeting Thomas and invited him over for dinner to become better acquainted with him. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen having dinner, Ellie's parents kept a close eye on Thomas as they tried to get an idea of his character. Although there weren't any obvious red flags, he was pretty quiet and seemed introverted. They thought it was probably due to his young age and the nerves of meeting Ellie's family. Understanding and supportive, Ellie's parents were keen on granting her space, knowing she was a bright and independent child. However, they observed Thomas and quietly wondered as to why Ellie chose someone who didn't quite seem to match her. Despite their certainty that Ellie and Thomas were incompatible, they held back from expressing their thoughts, respecting Ellie's judgment. Hoping for Ellie's happiness, they decided to give Thomas a chance. Thomas had even joined the celebration of Ellie's 17th birthday right in their own kitchen on the February 6, 2019. It was a moment where her parents warmly welcomed him into their home and extended gestures of affection and acceptance toward him. The honeymoon phase of Ellie and Thomas's relationship didn't last long. 3 months in, cracks began to show. Ellie, who was initially swept off her feet, felt her independence suffocated under Thomas's constant need for her. He craved her presence 247, and the spark of excitement morphed into a smothering clinginess. Any attempt of hers to meet friends or prioritize her levels was met with grumpy disapproval. The future Thomas envisioned, sprinkled with talk of marriage, clashed wildly with Ellie's desire for space and growth. Their dreams for their relationship were running on parallel tracks, destined to collide. Ellie, who yearned for freedom and a chance to be herself, felt trapped in a commitment she wasn't ready for. The once picture-perfect romance had become a struggle to balance expectations and maintain her own identity. She felt she wasn't ready for a serious relationship and wanted to focus on school, especially her upcoming exams. In early May 2019, Ellie informed her mom about her intention to end things with Thomas. Unsurprised by the news, her mom inquired if there was a specific reason or if Ellie needed to talk. Ellie reassured her mom that nothing had happened, and she simply wanted to stay single for a while. She urged her mom not to worry and that she had everything under control. Later, Ellie went to a room and broke up with Thomas through text. Thomas persistently denied the breakup and professed his love along with their compatibility, but Ellie stood strong on her decision. Sharing the news of their breakup with friends on May 2, 2019, she knew Thomas might feel upset, but hoped they could still remain friends. The following day, when police discovered Ellie in their kitchen, doubts arose about whether Thomas, an A-level student, could even possess the capability for such a thing. On the night of May 2, 2019, Ellie asked her parents if she could stay home the next morning because she didn't have classes until the afternoon. She planned to study for her exams before heading to school in the afternoon for her history class. The next morning, on May 3, 2019, she arranged for a friend, Ellie Welling, to pick her up at 12 p.m. to go to school together. On that day, Griffith's mother dropped him off at Harden Hoy School in Chippenham, where both he and Ellie were enrolled as sixth formers. Thomas entered the school cafeteria and inquired with Ellie's friends about her whereabouts. He had been searching for her since morning, eager to discuss the breakup they had the previous evening. When he got to know that Ellie wasn't in school, quickly decided to leave. Thomas clearly lied to inform a teacher that he wasn't feeling well and made his way to the nearby bus station as he headed back home. On reaching home, he swiftly changed his attire. He wore a black hoodie and different sneakers. However, as he prepared to leave, his mother unexpectedly returned home. He panicked and quickly hid in a cupboard until she left. When his mom left and he was by himself, Thomas took the spare car keys and drove to Ellie's house, which was about a 10-minute drive. When he got there, he knocked on her front door wanting to talk to her. It's said that they argued in the kitchen when Thomas understood Ellie was serious about breaking up. In the middle of the argument, he started choking Ellie when she tried hard to protect herself. Even though she fought back, Thomas didn't stop and Ellie passed out. He took a knife from the kitchen and stabbed Ellie in her neck, not once, but 13 times, even though she couldn't fight back. When he saw she was no longer moving, he washed the knife to remove his fingerprints. Then he made it look like Ellie hurt herself and arranged things in a way that seemed like she did it. After that, he cleaned up where it happened and then used Ellie's phone to text a friend while pretending to be her. He did this to make sure no one found Ellie's body until much later in the day. As Ellie fought to protect herself, she accidentally scratched Thomas on his face and neck. When Thomas saw these marks, he came up with a plan to cover up what he had done. He told his friends in a group chat that he was really upset because of the breakup and even said he was hurting himself on purpose, then sent messages to Ellie's phone as if he was unaware of anything unusual and suggested that they meet up to talk about their relationship. Police went to Thomas's house to inquire with him about Ellie. They immediately noticed his neck, which had fresh scratch marks that Ellie left on him when he had ruthlessly murdered her. Thomas denied having anything to do with Ellie's murder, but police knew there was more to the story. Examining the family's Wi-Fi router settings, investigators discovered Thomas's phone disconnected from the home network soon after he returned from school on the morning of May 3rd. It remained offline for several hours, reconnecting only after 12 p.m. Suspecting this time frame aligned with Ellie's murder, they scrutinized surveillance footage around Ellie's residence to gather more information. At 11:56, a passing bus's CCTV recorded a silver Ford Fiesta departing from Ellie's neighborhood. The vehicle's registration number was visible, leading the police to trace it back to the Griffiths family. As no other family member was at home at the time, it strongly implicated Thomas as the driver. Despite this evidence, Thomas persistently denied any role in Ellie's murder or being present at the crime scene. Upon further scrutiny of the family's Wi-Fi router, police discovered that Thomas's phone connected to the home network after 12 p.m. only to disconnect for an 18-minute window. The police turned their attention to the surroundings and identified a nearby wooded area. Walking out of Thomas's front door, they precisely timed a 9-minute walk towards the woods. Upon reaching the 9-minute mark, they halted and scrutinized the area. Swiftly, they uncovered a black bin liner that contained blood-stained napkins, clothes, and towels, later confirmed to hold Ellie's DNA. From the search in Thomas's room, investigators discovered a pair of black sneakers that contained Ellie's blood and that added on to the mounting evidence. Subsequently, Thomas was arrested and charged with the murder of Ellie Gould. In August 2019, Thomas confessed his intent to plead guilty to the crime. He recounted visiting Ellie's home on the morning of May 2nd, admitting to an argument and alleging a blackout, claiming inability to recollect subsequent events. In a heart-wrenching statement, Ellie's mother Carol expressed the family's trust in Griffith, recalling how they welcomed him into their home, even celebrating Ellie's birthday together. She painfully described the unimaginable act of holding Ellie's cold hand after her murder, a pain no parent should endure. Initially, she couldn't believe Griffiths, the innocent boy who loved their daughter, would harm Ellie. Matthew, Ellie's dad, described how the haunting image of her motionless body continuously disturbed his mind and affected his sleep and everyday routines. In court, it came to light that Griffiths, driven by Ellie's rejection, violently assaulted her. The autopsy indicated initial incapacitation from pressure on her neck, followed by over a dozen knife wounds. Before fleeing, Griffith staged the scene and placed Ellie's hand on the knife that he left near her neck to deceive investigators. He even tried to disguise the scratches on his face as self-inflicted, fabricating anxious messages to his friends. In November 2019, the Bristol Crown Court sentenced Thomas Griffiths to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 12 years. In court, a letter of apology from Griffiths was read aloud. Ellie's mother stared at Thomas and shook her head. Considering his age is a mitigating factor, as UK law doesn't permit life sentences for those under 18, the court also noted that his use of a knife from the victim's household doesn't suggest premeditation. Thomas Griffiths would become eligible for parole in 2031 at the age of 29. Ellie Gould's story was a heart-wrenching reminder of life's fragility and the cruel theft of dreams. Her hopes, love, and future were stolen. Besides, her plight highlighted the complexities within seemingly perfect relationships. The sadness of losing Ellie and the relentless pursuit of justice served as a cautionary tale for us to be mindful about those whom we let into our lives in a broader context. Carol Gould's push for tougher sentences in cases like Ellie's sparked essential conversations about domestic violence and sentencing for young offenders. Carol's initiative, Ellie's Law, sought fairness in sentencing, addressing the imbalance between those who bring weapons and those who use found weapons in terrible acts and for teenage murderers. After 2 tireless campaigns by Ellie's mother, Carol, and her family, they found victory after 2 years. This new legislation meant that teenage killers would now face potential sentences of up to 27 years and thus brought a sense of relief to those who fought so hard for justice. Silkair Flight 185 took off from Jakarta, Indonesia, on December 19, 1997, for what was intended to be an 80-minute journey to Singapore. The flight was piloted by Captain Su Wei Ming, 41, and First Officer Duncan Ward, 23. The first half hour was uneventful, with calm weather and normal communication between the pilots and air traffic control. However, things quickly took a tragic turn. 35 minutes after takeoff, Flight 185 suddenly banked sharply to the right and began a rapid descent from its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. The plane crashed into the Musi River in Sumatra less than a minute later, approximately halfway between Jakarta and Singapore. Local witnesses jumped into boats to search for survivors but found only small pieces of debris. When Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, NTSC, arrived at the scene, they faced the same disheartening outcome, officially confirming that all 104 individuals on board, the 97 passengers and 7 crew members, had lost their lives. Since the Boeing 737 was manufactured in the United States by an American company, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, became involved in the investigation. The NTSB had extensive experience in both 737 crash investigations and in underwater salvaging, the latter of which proved especially beneficial. The water of the Musi River is very murky, thanks to the deep layers of clay and mud that make up its riverbed. The poor visibility and enveloping riverbed made recovering what remained of the plane almost impossible. Investigators would eventually determine that in the final seconds before Silkair 185 crashed, it had been traveling faster than the speed of sound. This great power behind the impact forced pieces of debris as far as 15 feet into the thick mud. This created the first major problem facing the investigation, the lack of a debris field. Normally, air crash investigators look at the pattern in which the debris is scattered in order to determine the state the plane was in upon impact, and if any pieces had come loose from the main fuselage before impact. For example, investigators can tell that a plane disintegrated on impact if its debris field is relatively small and contained. If a plane had broken apart in the air, its debris field will be spread out over a larger area. Even in cases where a plane has crashed in water, investigators usually can map out a debris field based on components of the plane that float, like seat cushions. The mud and clay at the bottom of the river were so thick that they held down most of even these buoyant objects. This caused a great delay in the mapping of the crash site, which would normally be available to investigators very early on in the investigation. As with any investigation, the most important items to recover from the crash site were the 2 so-called black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the flight data recorder, FDR. The CVR records all noises made inside the cockpit, allowing investigators to hear not only what the pilots were saying during the flight and the eventual crash, but also how many and what kind of alarms may have been going off before impact. The FDR provides more technical data about how the plane and all of its systems had been functioning. Humongous cranes were brought in to dredge the bottom of the river for debris and hopefully locate the two recorders. Understanding the exact nature of Flight 185's sudden dive was of vital importance in determining what component of the plane had evidence from the FDR. Investigators used Indonesian air traffic control data to track Flight 185's flight path and calculate the plane's speed. Planes no longer appear on radar returns when they go below 20,000 feet above ground. As such, investigators only had Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet to examine. Even with this narrowed window, Flight 185's rate of descent was calculated as approximately 30,000 feet per minute. Terrifyingly, the maximum rate of descent for a 737 is normally 7,000 feet per minute. This gross anomaly provided the first major break in the investigation, but also served as a grave reminder of just how terrifying the final seconds on board the plane must have been for the passengers and crew. The first major pieces of the plane to be recovered were actually found outside of the massive search area in the river, about 2.5 miles east of the crash site deep in the Sumatran rainforest. Investigators found the horizontal stabilizer from Flight 185. Horizontal stabilizers are used to control the pitch of an airplane and are found in its back tail section. The distance from which the horizontal stabilizer fell from the rest of the plane indicated that it came off during the flight. Flight 185 had been flying during good weather, and there were no obvious conditions that would have minimized the pilot's visibility. The investigators' initial theory of the crash was that there had been some sort of catastrophic mechanical failure on the plane. This theory made quickly discovering the cause of the crash of Flight 185 of utmost importance. In 1997, the Boeing 737 was one of the most widely flown commercial airliners in the world. 5 new 737s came into service every month. Flight 185 had in fact been Silkair's newest 737, only been in service for 10 months. If a mechanical flaw inherent in the design of the 737 caused the crash of Flight 185, thousands of lives around the world were in danger every single day. These fears about the safety of the Boeing 737 received added merit from the model's troubled past. The 737 had been involved in several incidents of rudder hard-over. Rudder hard-over occurs when a plane's rudder, which controls the direction in which the plane's nose is turned, becomes jammed to one side and cannot be controlled by the pilot. By the time of the Silkair crash, the NTSB had officially attributed the crashes of 2 737s, resulting in the combined loss of 157 lives to rudder hard-over, and suspected that it played a part in at least 2 other incidents, which thankfully did not result in any loss of life. The separation of the tail section of Flight 185 would have been consistent with an occurrence of rudder hard-over. This possibility raised serious alarm bells for investigators. Boeing had engineered a fix for this problem before the construction of the plane that would eventually serve as Silkair Flight 185 even began. If this crash had been caused by rudder hard-over, then the perceived fix for the problem was in fact no fix at all, and thousands of modified 737s were still prone to rudder hard-over. As a result, closely inspecting Flight 185's Power Control Unit, PCU, the piece of the plane that Boeing had modified to correct the 737's rudder hard-over problem, became vital to the investigation. Fortunately, the PCU was one of the pieces of the plane that could be recovered from the crash site. The PCU as a whole and the servo valve within it that had failed in 2 previous fatal 737 crashes were available for examination. They were inspected for corrosion, but none was found. Everyone who examined the component found it to be in working order, and rudder hard-over was ruled out as a cause of the crash. Investigators now attributed the plane's tail ripping off of the back of the plane to its rapid and violent descent and not to a mechanical failure in the tail itself. While this was good news for Boeing and for 737 passengers around the globe, it left the team working on the Flight 185 case, still without an explanation for the crash. On the 5th day of the investigation, Christmas Eve of 1997, investigators, somewhat miraculously, located the flight data recorder of Flight 185. In an even more seemingly impossible stroke of luck, the cockpit voice recorder was found in the new year on the very last day the river was being searched. It was buried under 27 feet of mud. Both black boxes appeared to be in usable condition. However, Because Indonesia did not have a laboratory capable of analyzing the data on them, the recorders had to be sent to NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., creating another delay in the investigation. When the data from the recorders was finally analyzed, 3 weeks after the crash, it raised more questions than it answered. The FDR had somehow stopped recording while the plane was still in the air. Data was available for the first 34 minutes and 14 seconds of the flight, and it all fell within the expected ranges. After that, there was no data whatsoever. Since the recorder cut off roughly a minute before Flight 185's sudden descent, investigators could not blame the dive for the stopping of the recording. Whatever caused the tape to cut off happened before whatever caused the plane to crash. This left the investigative team with one more question it needed the recordings from the CVR to solve. Furthermore, with the loss of the final minutes of FDR data, the CVR was the only means investigators had of gaining insight into the last moments the plane was in the air and what was happening on board Flight 185 during its final terrifying descent. This loss of information posed a major problem for investigators, but the absence of the recordings itself will become a major clue in piecing together the final minutes of the flight later on in the investigation. Unfortunately, the CVR data was just as puzzling as the FDR data. The first 34 minutes of the recording contained nothing but normal communications, such as the captain's welcome to the passengers over the intercom and the standard checks the captain and the first officer would have gone over together. Neither pilot made any mention of anything unusual happening. Then, like the FDR, the CVR abruptly stopped recording. This was puzzling enough on its own, but the CVR also stopped recording almost 6 minutes before the FDR did, meaning there had most likely been two different causes for the two devices ceasing their recording. Because they are built to withstand a plane crash, black boxes are designed to be very durable and dependable. Any kind of power failure that would cause them to stop recording is exceptionally uncommon. There was also no indication that there had been anything wrong with the plane's electrical system, and such a flaw would not have explained the delay between the two units failing, as they were on two different circuits. The odds that both units would independently fail, much less right before the plane crashed, were almost too minute to be considered. Investigators began experimenting in a test plane to see if some sort of overload could have shorted the circuit and what effects it would have had on the devices. They discovered that it was possible to overload the circuit, but they also discovered that doing so resulted in a loud sound as the breaker popped. This sound was the last noise on the recording from the CVR on the test plane. However, the sound could not be heard on Flight 1805's CVR. With the investigators' possible causes for the failure of the boxes becoming increasingly more limited and simultaneously more disturbing, they ran one more scenario in the test plane, pulling the circuit manually. Doing so did not cause any noise on the recording. Having ruled out a physical cause for the failure of Flight 185's black boxes, investigators began looking into the unsettling reason why someone in the cockpit would disable the recorders. Lacking data about the plane's performance during its final minutes of flight from the FDR, investigators turned back to alternative sources of information. The radar data was used in a series of test flights in a simulator to determine what exact set of circumstances would result in Flight 185's descent from 35,000 feet to 20,000 feet on the specific path shown by radar returns. They tested over 20 different scenarios, including various mechanical failures, trying to match the path taken by Flight 185. None of the scenarios, including the initially suspected rudder hardover, fell within the parameters in the radar return data. The only way to get the simulated 737 to drop as steeply and as quickly as Flight 185 did was by having the pilot accelerate and continuously bank the plane sharply to the right. The only explanation for the accident was that it wasn't an accident, but an intentional maneuver made by one of the two pilots. Before going public with a horrifying theory, investigators began looking for physical evidence to support their version of events. The key piece in confirming that the plane had been in a commanded dive was its jack screw. A jack screw is a part located in the horizontal stabilizer of a plane that rotates when pilots push a switch on their control column. This turning moves the horizontal stabilizer up and down, changing the pitch of the plane. The NTSB was able to calculate the final pitch angle of the stabilizer based on the last setting of the recovered jack screw. The calculations confirmed that the horizontal stabilizer had not been in the expected cruising position. It had instead been in the nose-down position, The logical but horrible conclusion was that one of Flight 185's pilots intentionally crashed the plane into the river. According to the CVR, First Officer Duncan Ward had been alone in the cockpit shortly before the crash. Captain Su Wei-ming is heard asking his first officer if he would like some water and telling him that he is heading back into the cabin. The last sound the CVR captured was, rather than the popping noise of the CVR circuit as investigators had been looking for earlier, the sound of the captain's harness buckle clanging against the bottom of his chair as he stood up to leave the cockpit. In Indonesian flight traffic controllers confirmed that it was Ward they spoke to when they checked in 2 minutes before the plane began its fatal dive. However, with these final minutes unaccounted for by the CVR, investigators still had to work to determine who had been at the controls of the plane at the time of the crash. At this point, the investigation turned mainly towards the two pilots and their personal lives, trying to discern any reason as to why either of them would kill not only themselves but also 103 other people. Interviews with Silk Air staff showed that New Zealand-born First Officer Duncan Ward was generally well-liked and easy to work with. He had no debts, no troubled romantic relationships, and no history of any sort of mental illness. Initially, there was some suspicion that the pressures of living and working so far away from his home country and his entire family may have caused psychological problems for Ward, but his family members insisted that this was not the case. According to them, Duncan had loved flying since he was a teenager and considered himself very lucky to have the opportunity on paper. Captain Su Wei-ming similarly seemed to have plenty to live for and no motive to sabotage the flight. He was married and the father of 3 young boys and, as a former Air Force pilot, had risen through the ranks at Silk Air quickly. However, interviews with other pilots revealed that Captain Su had a reputation for often being willing to cut corners and take chances in order to decrease his flight times. 6 months before his death, he had been investigated by the airline because of a sharp landing he had made at an unsafe speed. The landing had been so violent that many of the passengers on board had gotten sick because of it. Captain Su had been demoted from an instructor captain to a regular captain as a result of the investigation. Looking further back into Captain Su's history as a pilot revealed a troubling coincidence. Silk Air, Flight 185, had crashed on December 19, 1997. On December 19, 1979, Su Wei-ming, then an Air Force pilot, took off for a training mission with 3 other fighter pilots. A mechanical problem with his jet caused him to have to turn around and return to base during the course of the mission. His 3 squadron mates continued on without him. All 3 died when their planes hit a mountain obstructed from their view by clouds. At least 2 of the other pilots were believed to have been close friends of Captain Su. Such a heavy loss and a potential case of survivor's guilt would have potentially made the date of December 19th highly emotionally charged for the captain. Su Wei-ming's finances also turned out to be a source of pressure at the time of the crash. He had lost over $1 million in the past 4 years through high-risk online securities exchanging. He had so many outstanding debts that his trading privileges in the Singapore stock market had been suspended at the time of the crash. On the morning of the crash, he had pledged to repay his large debts as soon as he returned to Singapore. Investigators suddenly had a mountain of motives for Captain Su to want to not only end his life but also to damage the reputation of Silk Air. However, just because Captain Su had a motive to crash the plane did not mean he actually did. The last known person to be in the cockpit before the crash was First Officer Ward. Furthermore, he had been alone, which would have given him the opportunity to crash the plane. However, these circumstances, in fact, seemed to exonerate him from suspicion. The cockpit voice recorder is on the captain's side of the cockpit in a 737. When Captain Su left the cockpit, his hand would have been within inches of it. He could have easily pulled the circuit to stop the CVR from recording without his first officer noticing. If First Officer Ward had been the one to pull the circuit, the CVR would have recorded the sounds of him unbuckling his harness and getting up to go over to where he could reach it. As such, it is most likely that Captain Su pulled the circuit as he left the cockpit as heard at the end of the CVR's recording. It is hard to imagine why the captain would want the CVR to stop recording unless he planned to do something that he would not want there to be a record of, like crash the plane. It is impossible to know exactly what happened in the final minutes of Flight 185. However, the circumstantial evidence leads investigators to believe that after First Officer Ward completed his last radio call, Captain Sue re-entered the cockpit. He made up a reason to send First Officer Ward into the cabin. Maybe he told him a flight attendant asked to see him, or perhaps he ordered him to take a final break before they needed to plan for landing. After the first officer left, Captain Sue would have locked the door. Pulling the circuit to the FDR, unlike the CVR, causes a loud master alarm. Captain Sue, by disarming the CVR, had shown that he was actively trying to prevent there being any record of what he planned to do. As such, he would have had to disarm the FDR as well. He had to have locked the door so as to prevent First Officer Ward from rushing back into the cockpit and potentially stopping him from crashing the plane when he heard the loud alarm. Captain Sue would have had to use all of his strength to push on the control column enough to cause the sharp descent recorded by the radar data, and he would not have been able to accomplish it while fighting off his first officer. Without the CVR, it is impossible to know if Ward tried to re-enter the cockpit to help when he heard the alarm, or if he had realized what was going on when he found the door to be locked. Since Captain Sue sent the plane into its final dive less than a minute after disarming the FDR, it is possible that Ward did not even have a chance to make it back to the door and try to re-enter the cockpit. It is probable, however, that First Officer Ward was standing at the time. Being unsecured by a seat belt or a harness, he would have likely been slammed into the ceiling of the cabin when the plane began its sharp bank. First Officer Ward could very well have been deceased or unconscious within seconds of the beginning of the plane's descent, unable to do anything to try to prevent it. Indonesia's NTSC released its report about Flight 185 3 years after the crash. Shockingly, the formal report disregarded the evidence presented by investigators and announced that no cause of the crash was discovered. The report claimed that there was insufficient evidence to determine a cause for the accident because the final minutes of the flight were not recorded. The NTSB publicly report cited a deliberate act on the part of Su Wei-ming as the cause of the crash and detailed the evidence with which that determination was reached, challenging both the notion that the cause of the accident was unknown and that there was insufficient evidence to reach a conclusion that the plane. There are obvious biases that could be influencing these differing opinions. The NTSC, publicly blaming a pilot flying out of their country's main airport for bringing down a plane, could have potentially damaged customer confidence in commercial air travel. The airport Flight 185 had taken off from a lone serviced over 18 million passengers a year at the time of the crash. The NTSC had an obvious motive to try to protect the large and rapidly expanding Indonesian air travel industry. Similarly, the NTSB had motive to protect Boeing, the makers of the 737, from civil lawsuits and the loss of its strong reputation. Allegations that the NTSB report was fabricated to protect the company persist to this day. Boeing was and still is one of the largest manufacturers of commercial airliners in the world and also had and has large aerospace and defense operations, including numerous contracts with the United States government. In 1997, the year of the Flight 185 crash, Boeing employed almost 250,000 million people and generated almost $46 billion in revenue. The company had weathered the crisis of the two US 737 crashes because it had corrected the problem with the model servo valve once it was discovered. If Boeing had incorrectly addressed this problem, the impact on its reputation and therefore its sales could have been catastrophic, since that could lead to the loss of 1,000 of American jobs and severely damage the US economy. The NTSB could have been biased against blaming the crash on a mechanical failure. Both agencies had serious economic and governmental pressures on the results they reported. Despite the conflicting reports issued by their government agencies, both American and Indonesian members of the team that actually investigated the crash take the available evidence to mean that Flight 185 was brought down by an intentional command, most likely by Captain Su Wei-ming. Furthermore, the NTSB report was authored by Greg Fife, who had been directly involved with the investigation and had personally dealt with the evidence. The NTSC report, on the other hand, had been released by the head of the committee, who would have been more aware of and concerned with the political and economic consequences of the committee's ruling. On top of the two conflicting conclusions about the cause of the crash presented by the two government agencies that were in charge of the investigation, blame was assigned to another party in 2004. A jury in a Los Angeles Superior Court concluded that the servo valve in the PCU was what brought down the plane. They ordered Parker Hannifin, the manufacturer of the PCU, to pay the three families who had brought the suit $43,600,000. The servo valve had been suspected early in the investigation into the crash of Flight 185 because problems with it had resulted in two previous 737 crashes. The NTSC, NTSB, and Parker Hannifin had all examined the servo valve and surrounding PCU and found it to be in working order. Evidence collected by the NTSB and the report it issued evaluating it were not allowed into evidence in the Los Angeles case. As such, jurors did not hear about the conclusion that Flight 185 was brought down intentionally, nor did they have access to the majority of the evidence available about Flight 185 because it was collected as part of the official investigation. Lacking the majority of the information about Flight 185's crash, the main source of information in the trial was testimony from a metals expert hired as part of a private investigation for the lawsuit. The expert presented photographs from a scanning electron microscope showing chips in the servo valve of the PCU recovered Flight 185. This expert also testified that these microscopic chips could have interfered with the operation of the plane's rudder, leading to rudder hardover and the crash. However, it is impossible. It initially announced that it would appeal the Los Angeles verdict. However, they eventually decided to settle out of court and pay an unspecified amount of money to each family involved in the crash. They did not, however, ever accept any liability for the crash of Flight 185. In addition to the settlement from Parker Hannifin, each victim's family received $100,000 from Silk Air and an undisclosed amount of compensation from Boeing. Because the NTSC report did not implicate Su Weiming in the crash, his family received the entirety of his death benefits. The cause of the crash of Silk Air 185 will probably always be a source of controversy. However, the evidence collected during the investigation most comprehensively points to the loss of the plane and all those on board as being a result of Captain Su Weiming intentionally piloting the plane into the Musi River. While the NTSB's evidence for its version of events is circumstantial, it is overwhelming. Around 11:25 p.m. on July 2, 1995, Shocker Road in Janpath, New Delhi, was beginning to quiet down. Two policemen, Constable Abdul Nazir Kunju and Home Guard Chandler Paul, were on patrol in the area. As they neared the Ashok Yatri Niwas Hotel, Kunju spotted flames coming from some nearby buildings. Alarmed by the possibility of a fire outbreak, the duo quickly initiated an investigation. Kunju headed toward the main entry gate of Yatri Niwas, making his way directly to the front of the Bajia Barbecue restaurant, located on the left just inside the hotel's main entrance. From this vantage point, he saw flames rising from the rear kitchen area of Bajia. As he approached, a uniformed security guard intercepted him, already informed about the situation. The guard explained that the fire had started from ignited waste paper and cardboard near the outdoor tandoor, reassuring Kunju that everything was under control and there was no cause for alarm. Satisfied with the explanation, policeman Kunju and Chanderpal proceeded to walk away towards Janpath Lane. As they began to move, Anaru Devi, a middle-aged vegetable vendor often seen showcasing her produce beside the Mother Dairy Milk booth at the lane's entrance from Ashaka Road, hurriedly approached them. With her voice trembling in fear, Anaru exclaimed about the hotel being on fire. Her panicked outcry had attracted the attention of several men nearby, who also began to raise the alarm. Kunju realized how serious the situation had become upon seeing the size of the fire. The flames were already clearly visible from the lane, showing that it was more than just a small fire, with thick smoke soaring high, reaching to about 30 to 35 feet above Bagya's outer wall on Janpath Lane. Kunju and Chander hurried back to the closed restaurant's entrance. By that time, Kunju started quietly cursing as he expressed his frustration, mentioning that those involved were attempting to burn the entire hotel down. Kunju then moved beyond the hotel entrance and approached the canvas screen situated in front of the Bajia Barbecue. Upon lifting the screen and gazing into the dimly lit restaurant, he encountered a slender man approximately in his late 20s or early 30s, standing about 5 foot 10 inches tall and attired in a white kurta, a traditional Indian garment. This man casually informed Kunju that they were just burning some old posters and reassured him that the fire was under control. He mentioned that they had taken adequate precautionary measures and there was no reason to worry. Despite the man's reassurance, Constable Kunju remained unconvinced. He left Chanderpal near the hotel and quickly made his way to a nearby phone booth, only to find it closed. He then jogged towards the police picket situated at the rear of the Western Court complex, located a couple of 100 meters away. Once there, he urgently relayed a wireless report of the fire to the Carnot Place police station and made calls to the police control room and the fire brigade requesting immediate assistance. Upon his return to the hotel, Kunju was dismayed to witness that the blaze had escalated during his absence, with thick smoke rising high above the hotel complex. They marched towards the entrance of the restaurant and assertively demanded entry to inspect the fire. Once more, the men at the restaurant refused to allow him entry. Determined, Kunju wouldn't be discouraged this time. Pretending to retreat from the Bagya, he and Chanderpal exchanged secretive words as they walked away together from the front of the hotel. Rushing down John Poth Lane, they swiftly scaled the 7-foot-high wall at the restaurant's rear without hesitation. Kunju managed to enter the covered rear area of the garden restaurant. Without delay, they headed straight for the fire. The fire presented an alarming and disproportionate scene within the kitchen. Fueled by a heap of wooden logs, planks, and assorted materials piled atop the tandoor, it blazed with ferocity. One slender man, the same individual who had earlier dismissed Kunju at the front of the another man dressed in a blue-printed shirt and a muscular young man stood nearby. At a distance, adjacent to the canvas screen by the hotel's entrance, stood a robustly built man wearing white. Curiously, these individuals appeared entirely indifferent to the foul smell emanating from the inferno. Kunju warned the man stoking the flames, cautioning him about the potential risk of causing a fire that could engulf the entire hotel. Upon being informed by the individual tending to the fire about his affiliation as a Congress Party worker engaged in burning old materials, including posters and waste paper, Kunju remained composed. Instead of being deterred by the political association, he immediately looked around for a bucket. This marked a moment where the young constable truly showcased his determination. Some individuals might have hesitated upon hearing about the political connection, particularly with the influential Congress Party. They might have offered a mild caution about fire safety before ultimately withdrawing. However, Kunju stood firm. He was alarmed by the considerable blaze before him and, alongside Chanderpal, swiftly gathered any available buckets and containers. They filled these from a nearby kitchen tap and promptly began extinguishing the flames. Soon, Sub-Inspector Rajesh Kumar arrived at the scene just as Kunju and Chanderpal were diligently working to suppress the fire. Unlike the attempt to dismiss a constable earlier, no one dared to send a sub-inspector away. Accompanied by 2 security guards from the main hotel, Rajesh and his constables entered the restaurant and joined Kunju in combating the blaze. Working together, they successfully extinguished the fire within a matter of minutes. The intense flames had ignited certain plastic-coated overhead cables, causing further damage. Kunju, Sub-Inspector Rajesh Kumar, and the hotel guards proceeded to investigate the extent of the cable damage. Their objective was to determine whether the fire had spread to the building's first floor. They advanced towards the main lobby of Yatri Niwas, which led to the Coconut Grove restaurant. Ascending 2 flights of stairs, they reached the lower split-level first-floor terrace, overlooking the Bajia complex. Constable Kunju leaned over the edge of the mezzanine roof in search of the wires that had caught fire. Instead, he was met with a rush of hot air and foul-smelling smoke billowing upwards. To his surprise, he noticed that the fire above the tandoor, which they had previously extinguished, had reignited. The man he had observed earlier in the Bajia, the sturdy individual clad in white, was once again fueling the flames. Kunju's initial alarm transformed into exasperation at the careless disregard for safety displayed by these people. Hurrying to the rear edge of the roof without considering the steep drop below, he leapt down, landing forcefully on the paved rear courtyard of the restaurant. Swiftly advancing towards the fire, he pushed aside the wicket fence obstructing his way and approached the tandoor from the rear. Kunju discovered that the man in the kurta pajama and his 2 companions had vanished. Yet the fire continued to rage. It was at this moment that Kunju noticed a peculiar scent. Amidst the pungent and unpleasant odor, a distinct smell of roasted meat filled the air. However, this scent was not of ordinary food cook. Rather, it carried the unmistakable and haunting odor of burning flesh. Instead of finding chicken meat being prepared, they came across something profoundly disturbing. The oven contained a human body, dismembered and partially burnt. This unsettling discovery reverberated throughout the city, leaving its residents deeply disturbed and shocked. Now, two key questions surfaced. Who might the body have belonged to, and who could have been responsible for this gruesome deed? And so began the quest for information regarding the disturbing Tandoor Kund. The dismembered and burned body parts underwent testing, and upon receiving the results, the victim's identity was unveiled. She was 29-year-old Naina Sahini. Naina, a Congress worker in New Delhi, was married to 34-year-old Sushil Sharma, who was also a youth Congress leader. The initial postmortem, conducted at Lady Harding Medical College in Delhi, concluded that the cause of death was burn injuries. Subsequently, a second postmortem was ordered by the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi. This examination was carried out by a team of 3 doctors from different hospitals, led by T. Deep Dogra. During this examination, 2 bullets were discovered in the head and neck region, leading the conclusion that the cause of death was due to firearm injuries. Now, as per protocol, the police intended to meet with Sushil Sharma, but he was nowhere to be located. However, the same fate did not befall the man who was involved in burning the remains at the hotel. The individual responsible for burning the remains was apprehended and identified as Keshav Kumar, the restaurant manager of the Bajia Hotel. It didn't take long for him to disclose the identity of the other person involved, who indeed turned out to be Naina's husband, Sushil Kumar. The case seemed close to resolution almost immediately upon the initial disclosures. Yet the grim and sinister nature of this case cast a long shadow over the city, leaving a haunting impact for a prolonged period. A few days later, on July 10, 1995, Sushil Sharma surrendered. Now all that remained was to uncover the events that transpired on the day Naina was killed and ensure that justice was served. During the interrogation, it was disclosed that Sushil and his wife Naina had a friend named Matlaub Karim. Matlaub and Naina had been classmates and were colleagues in the Congress Party, sharing a close bond. However, Sushil disapproved of Naina's friendship with Matlaub. Arguments frequently arose between the couple over this issue, but his possessiveness took a much darker turn on the night of July 2, 1995. On that tragic night, upon returning home, Sushil encountered Naina conversing on the phone while consuming alcohol. As Naina noticed Sushil's presence, she ended the call abruptly. In a fit of anger, Sushil redialed the phone and discovered Matlaub on the other end of the line. Enraged beyond control and despite Naina's attempts to explain, Sushil fatally shot her. Subsequently, he wrapped the body in a plastic bag, placed it in the trunk of his Maruti, and proceeded to transport it to the Bajia barbecue restaurant, and conspired with the restaurant manager, Keshav Kumar, to dispose of it. Naina's body was dismembered and then incinerated in a tandoor oven. With this information gathered, along with a few DNA tests to confirm the killer's identity, the Delhi police conducted an investigation into the case and submitted a charge sheet on July 27, 1995 in a sessions court. Subsequently, on November 7, 2003, Sushil Sharma was sentenced to death while the restaurant manager Keshav Kumar received 7 years of rigorous imprisonment. Sushil appealed against the district court's verdict in the Delhi High Court, yet the High Court upheld the decisions made by the lower courts. His death sentence was subsequently confirmed by the Delhi High Court in 2007. However, in 2013, the Supreme Court commuted his death sentence, citing the absence of evidence that Sushil had dismembered his wife's body. On October 8, 2013, a 3-judge bench consisting of Chief Justice Sathasivam and Justices Ranjana Desai and Ranjan Gogoi upheld Sharma's conviction. The court reduced his death sentence to life imprisonment, due to Sushil's lack of a prior criminal record and the nature of the crime. Although both the trial court and the High Court had ordered Sushil Sharma's execution, the Supreme Court modified the sentence stating, "It is not a crime against society, but a crime committed due to his strained relationship with his wife." On December 21, 2018, the Delhi High Court issued an order for the immediate release of Sushil Sharma. The court questioned whether a person could be detained indefinitely for a murder offense even after completing a designated sentence. However, by that time, Sushil had already been released after serving 23 years in jail. According to Sushil, if he hadn't committed the crime, he believed he could have potentially become a union minister. After his release from jail, Sushil appeared to have changed as a person. Yet one cannot really know the truth that lurks beneath the superficial demeanor. When questioned about the dismemberment of Naina's body after the murder and the events of that night, here's what Sushil had to say. Regarding his future plans, despite once being a full-fledged politician, he stated that he would not pursue his career in that direction anymore and instead had different ideas in mind. On the other hand, the hero who made justice possible, policeman Kunju's life had taken a turn. Kunju, speaking to Times of India, mentioned that he had received only 5 rupees as his reward for his brave actions. Despite making headlines in various media outlets, he now sees the incident as a brief moment of attention. Kunju claimed that the Delhi police did not acknowledge or value his policing abilities, quick response, and vigilance. He opted for voluntary retirement in 2012 and relocated to Kerala to care for his unwell mother. The 51-year-old retired officer shared that while he received an out-of-turn promotion, he was deprived of all the accompanying benefits associated with it. He mentioned being denied a salary increase under the 6th Pay Commission, highlighting that even lower-ranked constables who joined after him were earning more. Despite holding the position of head constable, Kunju stated that his requests were consistently rejected. Kunju discovered a blood-stained plastic bag nearby containing the remaining parts of Naina's body and was threatened by Sushil and Keshav Kumar. Despite this threat, Kunju remained steadfast and fulfilled his duties, including attending court proceedings even after his retirement. His story shows that sometimes even the just are treated poorly when they go against those in power. Do you believe that Sushil shot Naina due to insecurity? Or was there something else? Do you think the punishment he received was fitting, or should it have been a death sentence? In 1930, the Maroney family from Chicago faced a challenging period. Michael and Catherine, the couple, had 2 daughters, 2-year-old Mary Agnes and 11-month-old Anastasia, and they were expecting their 3rd child. The Great Depression had severely impacted them, and the limited work Michael could find was low-paying. In desperation, he published a letter in a local newspaper outlining their situation and seeking employment. As a result of the letter, the Maroney family received some support. A man named Edgar Gilpin came to their apartment, which was above a grocery store on Wentworth Avenue in Chicago, and brought Michael a suit and a pair of shoes. Another individual came to the home on May 14th looking to help the Maroney children. A woman, calling herself Julia Otis, arrived at the apartment claiming that her social worker had sent her to see how she could help the family. She had gotten their address from the newspaper that had published Michael's letter and arrived at their door with fruits and vegetables she had purchased at the grocery store downstairs. While she was there, the woman became taken with Mary Agnes, saying that she had always wanted a child just like her. The woman returned the following day, May 15, 1930, this time bringing a large bundle of clothing for the Maroney's unborn child. She offered to take Mary Agnes around the corner to buy clothing for her as well. Catherine agreed to let Mary Agnes go with her. The woman never returned with Mary Agnes. The Maroneys contacted the police and provided them with a general description of the woman, calling herself Julia Otis. She was approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall, 125 pounds, 22 years old, and smartly dressed in a gray suit and a gray lace hat. The day after Mary Agnes was taken, her parents received a letter wrapped around a $5 bill from Julia Otis. In the letter, she said that she was taking Mary Agnes to California but would return her in a few months after Catherine gave birth and the family adjusted to having the new baby. She said she had hired a special nurse to help take care of Mary Agnes and the little girl was being well taken care of. She promised to help the family get back on their feet and told Michael and Catherine not to worry about Mary Agnes. They, of course, did not follow this advice. Chicago police searched train stations and interviewed individuals who worked on board trains, looking for any indication that Mary Agnes had been transported out of town. They also traced the baby clothes Julia Otis had brought to the Maroneys to the Goldblatt's department store at Ashland and Chicago Avenues. The clothes had been paid for using a brand new $50 bill. The police also took Edgar Gilpin, the man who had donated clothing to Michael Maroney, into custody in case he had been involved in the plot to abduct Mary Agnes. Another letter came in the day after first, trying to explain the actions of Julia Otis. The letter was signed Alice Henderson and claimed to be from a cousin of Julia Otis. The letter claimed that Julia's husband had previously passed away and her child had recently died as well. The loss of her child had caused her to have a nervous breakdown. It again assured the Marones that their daughter would be returned to them in a few months. For days after Mary Agnes went missing, her parents were able to secure a warrant from a judge charging Julia Otis with Mary Agnes kidnapping. However, Julia Otis was not found to face these charges, and Mary Agnes Maroney was not found to be reunited with her family. The assurances of the two letters proved false, and Mary Agnes was never returned, no matter how many months passed. More than 20 years after Mary Agnes went missing, a Chicago newspaper claimed to have solved her case and reunited her with her parents. In 1952, the Chicago Daily News partnered with a newspaper in California where Mary Agnes was believed to have been taken based on the letter from Julia Otis. The Oakland Tribune published photographs of various members of the Maroney family, which were seen by a man who believed they all looked very similar to his wife, 24-year-old Mary Beck McClelland. Mary had been adopted the year Mary Agnes was kidnapped. The Chicago Daily News arranged for a variety of tests, which they claimed did not exclude Mary McClelland as possibly being Mary Agnes, although the value of these tests is questionable based on current scientific standards. These tests included the examination of dental casts taken from Mary McClelland, and members of the anthropologists claimed that genetic factors in teeth proved that Mary McClelland was in fact Mary Agnes Maroney. The paper arranged for Catherine Maroney to meet with Mary and declared the case solved on their front page. While the paper reported that Catherine believed Mary was her daughter for their story on what they claimed had been an emotional family reunion, the Marones did not believe that Mary was their daughter. Mary did not have a birthmark on her cheek as Mary Agnes did, or a scar Mary Agnes had as the result of a surgery to repair a herniated navel. After meeting Mary, Catherine said that she was a wonderful person, and while she wished Mary was her daughter, she was not. Mary did become a friend of the Maroney family and stayed in contact with them. The media coverage in California also brought another woman who thought she could be Mary Agnes into the Marones' life. She too became a family friend. In 2008, a DNA test conducted after Mary McClelland's death showed that she was not Mary Agnes. And 10 years later, DNA also proved that the other Maroney family friend was not Mary Agnes either. Catherine and Michael Maroney would go on to have a total of 8 children. Neither of them ever recovered from Mary Agnes kidnapping. Catherine fell into a deep depression and died in 1962 at just 49 years of age. Michael died at age 58 with his last words reportedly being, "They never found my baby girl." Michael and Catherine both made their other children promise to never give up looking for their sister until they found her. As the 100th anniversary of Mary Agnes kidnapping grew closer, cold cases were getting a lot of attention both nationwide and in Chicago specifically. In 2011, the office of Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart had undertaken a major investigation trying to identify John Does killed by John Wayne Gacy, successfully uncovering the identities of 3 of them in the next 10 years. In addition, the office's Missing Persons Project is working to solve cases of women who have been missing for more than 3 years, and used cases are listed in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, or NAMUS. One of the investigators assigned to the unit was Detective Jose Rodriguez. On June 10, 2022, Detective Rodriguez was tasked with investigating Mary Agnes' disappearance. He turned to the technique that was being widely used nationwide and had been successfully used in the Gacy investigation, genetic genealogy. Detective Rodriguez reached out to members of the Maroney family and learned that several of Mary Agnes' relatives had profiles on commercial DNA sites like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. Some members of family had hoped that these sites would help them find Mary Agnes on their own. When they learned that Mary Agnes' case was being reopened and that their DNA could help, another relative submitted their DNA as well. Their results all ultimately revealed a second or third cousin that none of them knew. Detective Rodriguez was able to get in contact with this individual, a woman named Lori Hart. She, in turn, gave the contact information for her aunt, Terry Arnold, whose mother, Jeanette Burchard, was now being considered as potentially being Mary Agnes Maroney. Jeanette Damon spent the first 6 years of her life in Chicago, just 11 miles away from the Maroney family. She had been told that her date of birth was April 14, 1928, and that her father had died when she was just 2 months old. She was raised by her mother and later a stepfather. She was never abused, and, unlike many children growing up during the Great Depression, she never went hungry and always had anything she could possibly want. She was raised as a devout Catholic and received a good education. Her family moved to Virginia in 1934 and then to Florida during World War II. Sometime in 1940s, she married Edgar Jennings and had 3 children. She and her husband divorced in 1961, and she remarried to a man named Earl Thomas Burchard in 1977. Earl died in 1989. Jeanette worked as a nurse for more than 50 years and loved the opera, particularly Madame Butterfly. She was also a fan of the Miami Dolphins from the day the team was established in 1966. Jeanette was a devoted mother who loved all of her children dearly. She would later become a grandmother who was always there for her grandchildren. She was also very attached to her pets. She had all of her cats and dogs cremated, and their remains were buried with her when she passed away in 2003 at the age of 75. When detective contacted Jeanette's daughter, Terry, she was initially positive her mother could not be Mary Agnes Maroney. She could not imagine her grandmother being involved in a child abduction. She decided to take a commercial DNA test to prove the detective's theory wrong. However, when she received her results, they were not what she was expecting. While her mother's family was Polish, Terry's DNA showed that she did not have Polish ancestry. Rather, she was of Irish descent, like the Maroney family. Furthermore, the test identified Mary Agnes's nieces and nephews as her cousins. Terry's initial reaction was anger at her grandmother. It is still unclear how exactly Mary Agnes came into her custody and was raised as Jeanette. Previously, the family had no reason to believe Jeanette was not her mother's biological child. The only suspicious event in her life was an occasion when Jeanette's stepfather alluded to her not being her mother's natural child. He did not provide any other information. Jeanette contacted her cousins in Chicago to see if they had any information about this claim, but they had no idea why he would say this. Terry has been working through these complex emotions. She has been working through these complex emotions. She has been in contact with the Maroney family and is enjoying getting to know them. She has spoken to them several times over the phone and sent them photographs of her mother. She believes that had her mother been alive when the truth about her origins was revealed, she would have pursued a relationship with the Maroneys. She would have wanted to reassure them that she was alive and well and had lived a good life. Terry also believes that her mother would have loved being part of such a big family. While the DNA evidence seems to prove that Jeanette Burchard was Mary Agnes Maroney, the evidence is indirect. In order to prove this identification to an adequate legal standard, both Jeanette and Catherine Maroney's remains would need to be exhumed for direct DNA samples to be taken and compared. Terry Arnold told Detective Rodriguez from their earliest communications that she is not comfortable with an exhumation of her mother's remains. The missing person's remaining means of investigating how exactly Mary Agnes came to live with the woman who raised her as her daughter. Therefore, Mary Agnes' case does not fit the official criteria needed for it to be removed from NAMUS. Even after police announced that the investigation was closed on February 3, 2023, the case remained listed in the database as the oldest case from Illinois. As the Maroney family accepts that Mary Agnes lived out her life as Jeanette, they consider it solved and are no longer looking for her. Investigators were apparently ultimately successful using their acceptance as a means of getting the case removed from the database several months later. While Mary Agnes was never reunited with her family, the Marones feel that this resolution was still, in some ways, positive. Mary Agnes's nephew, Don Maroney, told the Chicago Sun-Times, "One of our hopes was that, when Mary Agnes was taken, that she led a good life and she was taken care of, and she was." On December 5, 1975, Lindy Sue was discovered stabbed to death in her Lancaster, Pennsylvania apartment. Her aunt and uncle discovered her body soon after the attack around 8:30 p.m. There had been no sign of forced entry, and Lindy Sue had last been seen grocery shopping at 6:30 p.m., leading detectives to believe that she'd been attacked shortly after returning home. Her shopping bags were still on the dining room table. Lindy Sue was married, and her husband Phil was quickly cleared as a suspect. Her autopsy revealed she'd been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives. One was still embedded in her neck and come from within the home. The other wasn't found at the crime scene. It was a horrific scene and had been a violent death. Lindy had several defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but she fought back. At some point, she'd been able to injure her attacker, and blood evidence from an unknown male was able to be preserved. Unfortunately, despite an exhaustive investigation, all suspects in the case were able to be eliminated. And eventually, without anything new, the case went cold. Over the next 4 decades, the case would be reopened and re-examined. The DNA was retested in 1997 against all the suspects in the original investigation, but they were cleared. The 4 male DNA was uploaded to Cody's in 2000, and the FBI BAU reviewed the case and hypothesized the killer was a male who knew Lindy and committed the crime in a fit of rage. When the Golden State Killer was identified using genetic genealogy in 2018, the Lancaster District Attorney's Office put forth Lindy Sue's cold case forward for consideration. The genetic genealogy testing was approved. They began working with Parabon Nanolabs. In 2019, Parabon created a computer-generated image of what the suspect might have looked like based on his DNA. Next, they worked on a new method of establishing a family tree for the suspect. They were able to identify a suspect who was discovered to be living and had never moved from the Lancaster area. 65-year-old David Sinopoli had never been a suspect in the original investigation, but detectives learned he lived in the same building as the Beechlers in 1975. Sinopoli was placed under surveillance and was seen to have discarded a to-go coffee cup, which was collected and used to compare to the suspect's DNA. It was a confirmed match. Sinopoli was arrested at his home on December 11, 2022, nearly 47 years to the day of Lindy Sue's murder. Sinopoli didn't have a significant criminal history. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to invasion of privacy and disorderly conduct. He had been working at a tanning salon and admitted to spying on a woman tanning. Since then, he has kept a very low-profile life. He married in 1974, divorced in 1986, and was remarried a year later. His 3 children, was an avid hunter according to social media, and frequently traveled to Italy. He was charged with 1 count of criminal homicide and is being held without bail while he waits for further court proceedings. No word yet on if he has any further court dates. It was during a blizzard on November 6, 1988, when Betty Rolfe decided to walk to work at the Appleton County Air Banquet Room in Appleton, Wisconsin. It wasn't her normal routine to walk to work, but 60-year-old Betty didn't like to drive in the snow, and her son wasn't able to give her a ride that morning. It shouldn't have taken her long. It was only 10 blocks from her home, but she never arrived. She was reported missing when her husband discovered she hadn't returned home from work. It was then that he learned she'd never arrived that day. Her body was found covered in gravel and partially clad under a railroad bridge 2 days later. An autopsy showed she'd been strangled to death, sexually assaulted, and beaten. The murder case shocked the community. Betty had been well known to the area. She was well liked. No one could imagine anyone setting out to hurt her. That, paired with the differentiation between her normal routine and the snowstorm, led law enforcement to believe it was a crime of opportunity. DNA evidence was collected at the time of the initial investigation, but all that could be done was tested against the suspects they had, which eliminated all. Eventually, the case went cold. In 2001, the DNA was input into Cody's, the federal database, and the state database, but nothing came up. In 2019, the case was reopened in hopes of using genetic geology to find the suspect. This year, they were able to narrow down the DNA to 2 brothers. Law enforcement approached one of the brothers who cooperated with police, but believed his brother to be deceased. He supplied a DNA sample, which eliminated him as a suspect, leading law enforcement to believe that 66-year-old Gene C. Meyer of Tacoma, Washington, was their suspect. In the 80s, Meyer lived within a mile of Betty Rolfe and left Wisconsin shortly after her murder, relocating to Washington. Law enforcement in both states worked together to locate Meyer, and he was put under surveillance. Law enforcement were able to collect DNA sample from the handle of his truck. Once it was positively matched with the suspect's DNA, he was arrested. He is currently being held and is awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. It was January 22, 1980 in Miramar, Florida, when Evelyn Fisher Bamforth opted to stay home for the evening. The 32-year-old nurse had hurt her knee and decided it would be best to rest it so she could get back to work. Her husband, John, went out for the evening. The couple were newly married. They had only just moved to Florida from the Cayman Islands. John worked in restaurants as a bartender and manager and was just settling into Miramar. Evelyn was from Chilliwack, British Columbia, and was a shining star in her family, the first to become a nurse in her family, and she was described as caring, smart, and a joy to be around. When John came home that evening, he said that he saw a police tape on their front door advising no one to enter. He had no idea what was going on and entered anyway. Immediately, he noticed something was wrong. Furniture had been strewn about, and there was stuff everywhere. When he went into their bedroom, he said that their bed was half soaked in blood. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Law enforcement hadn't notified him or stayed at the crime scene. It would only be when he went to the police department that he was notified that his wife had been murdered earlier that evening. He was given little details about what had happened, and he was devastated by the news. A friend had discovered the murder when she forgot her keys and went over to Evelyn and John's house. She knew Evelyn was home that night and knew she was supposed to be in. She knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. Then she saw one of the panes of glass next to the door had been broken and called the police. When police entered, they found Evelyn's body in the bedroom. She had been brutally bludgeoned to death, and she had been sexually assaulted. John had been at work, and his alibi was quickly cleared. Months later, they did have a strong suspect in the case when another county's police department approached Miramar PD with a nearly identical murder. The suspect in that case was Ronald Eugene Richards. The 32-year-old was out on parole for murdering his girlfriend in 1975 in Ohio. When law enforcement went to question Richards, they discovered he lived only 12 doors down from Evelyn and John. The Miramar PD didn't have enough evidence to charge Richards, but in the other case, the Volusia County PD had enough to charge and arrested him. He was convicted in that case in 1982 and served 38 years in prison before he was released in 2020. In 2022, Evelyn's case was reopened and the evidence in the case was retested for DNA. There, they found a sample of foreign male DNA and ran it through a CODIS. From there, they were able to positively identify it to Ronald Eugene Richards. Richard was out on probation and was quickly arrested in Ohio. He is now waiting to be extradited back to Florida, where he was charged with Evelyn's murder. Miramar PD have also stated that they believe Richards was a serial predator and are looking to see if any other cold cases are connected to him. John, who now resides in the UK, has expressed relief about the new development. He said that the murder of his wife had a devastating impact on his life, leading to substance abuse to numb the guilt he felt, which became an issue he struggled with for decades. He told the media that despite the relief of the arrest, the news also brought up difficult memories. He said, quote, "But for Evelyn, justice is the most important thing. No word yet on what is next for Richard. He may opt to take a plea agreement if offered. In Florida, the death penalty remains on the table at this time." Frank Batts was a United States Marine and a veteran of World War II. During his service, he was stationed at Camp Pendleton in Southern California for a period. After completing his military duty, Frank and his family decided to stay in California, settling in San Diego. He and his wife Elaine had 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. Frank often took his son John fishing on a barge anchored off the coast near Oceanside. Frank and Elaine opened a small store, Bott's Gift Shop, in the College Grove Shopping Center. On the afternoon of Saturday, April 2, 1977, a customer came into Bott's gift shop, but no one was there to greet them. When they walked to the back of the store, they discovered Frank's body in the store's office. He had been stabbed to death in what would later be determined to be a robbery. He was 61 years old at the time he was killed. It would take 46 years and 5 labs in 2 states to finally solve Frank's murder. A renewed investigation into the case began in 2021. In the summer of that year, a match was found to a set of fingerprints collected from the glass counter at the gift shop when the scene was processed after Frank's murder. The technology required to adequately process these years-old fingerprint lifts had only been developed within the previous decade. Still, investigators hope to find more corroborating evidence. They therefore use multiple labs to look for and process DNA evidence. A hat, which investigators describe as distinctive, had been found in the office along with Frank's body. It did not belong to him, and police believed his killer had lost it in the struggle that had ended with Frank's murder. One of the labs working with the investigators from the San Diego District Attorney's Office ultimately developed technology that allowed them to pull a DNA sample from the hat and match it to an individual whose DNA was on file. The DNA profile from the hat matched a DNA profile later extracted from scrapings taken from Frank's fingernails at his autopsy. The DNA profile belonged to the same individual, identified in 2021, as having left their fingerprints at the scene. In May of 2023, the San Diego District Attorney's Office identified the person responsible for the murder of Frank Botts as Norman Lamont Jones. Jones had been just 16 years old at the time of Frank's murder, but he was already 2 years into his criminal career. He would go on to have an extensive criminal record and be in and out of jail until 1991. When he was killed in an officer-involved shooting after a robbery at a store in the Fashion Valley shopping mall. Frank's son, John, has expressed relief both at finally having resolution to his father's case and at knowing that his father's killer had not been able to hurt anyone else after 1991. Joyce Casper was a generous, vivacious woman and the mother of 2 daughters and a son. She was loved by her children as well as their friends. Joyce owned a drugstore and soda fountain in the Vista Village Shopping Center in Boise, Idaho. Her children's friends from the local junior high school would come in to have lunch there, and Joyce would dote on all of them. Decades later, they would still remember the affection she showed towards them and the attention she gave to them. By 1987, Joyce's soda fountain no longer existed, but 65-year-old Joyce still owned a business at the location on Vista Avenue. She was now the owner and operator of Casper's Vista Hallmark and Gift Shop. On the morning of October 13, 1987, Joyce's vehicle was found near some railroad tracks at Day Drive and Robert Street, just a few blocks away from her store. Her body was inside of the car. While evidence suggested to police that Joyce had been murdered, they could not determine the exact cause of her death. They were able to determine that she had been sexually assaulted. Joyce was known to be a hard worker who often kept very late hours at her shop. The doors to the store were locked when police went there after the discovery of her body. They believed she had been abducted outside of her shop as she left in the early morning hours of 13th. She was then sexually assaulted and killed, with her body being found a few hours later. Those who knew Joyce could not fathom that someone would want to hurt her, and those who lived and worked around her shop were shocked that such a violent crime could occur in their neighborhood. However, a recent incident had placed Joyce in danger. Just a few weeks before she was killed, Joyce called police to report that she had been attacked in her store. A young man, believed to be between the ages of 17 and 25, with slicked back, black hair, had attacked Joyce in her store but had run off when she fought back. Police were not able to identify this individual, but after Joyce was killed, they feared he may have been the person responsible for her murder. Joyce's purse had been emptied and one of her credit cards was missing. There were no security cameras in the area of her store or where Joyce and her car were ultimately found, and no witnesses could be located. Nearly 150 suspects were investigated in the following years. Semen was found at the scene, and eventually DNA was extracted from it. However, no match to it was ever located in criminal databases. The case was formally reopened in 2017 for the 30th anniversary of Joyce's murder. 2 investigators were assigned to work on her case full-time. They submitted the DNA from Joyce's crime scene to Parabon Nanolabs, who used it to generate an image of what the contributor of the DNA may have looked like. They found that the DNA profile was consistent with an individual who had dark hair and dark eyes and may have had Colombian or Puerto Rican ancestry. The image was released to the public, but no one called in to police, reporting that they recognized the man in the image. In 2019, what would ultimately be a years-long effort to use genetic genealogy case started working with another company, Identifiers International. An extensive family tree was developed, and detectives looked into records of 100 of individuals trying to ascertain how they were related to Joyce's killer. They also collected DNA samples from numerous distant relatives of the killer, trying to figure out exactly where he would be situated within the family tree. Various social media sites and genealogical databases from all over the country were searched for leads. Investigators ultimately came into contact with a man who told them he had a half-brother who had lived in Idaho. They were able to get in contact with the half-brother's ex-wife in California. She had 2 sons with this man, but they were both homeless and difficult to contact. A detective did eventually find them in Los Angeles, and they provided samples of their DNA. Their DNA profiles confirmed that the DNA from the semen found at Joyce's crime scene belonged to their father. On July 7, 2023, the Boise Police Department announced that they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for Joyce Casper's murder as Frank A. Rodriguez. He had been just 17 years old at the time of Joyce's murder. Rodriguez could not be charged with the murder because he had taken his own life in 2007. Rodriguez's family cooperated with police, and his mother is still alive. Boise Police Detective Paul Jagosh likened informing her of the DNA match to a death notification based on how devastated she was to learn of what her son had done. The Boise Police Department is currently looking into the possibility that Rodriguez may have been involved in other unsolved cases. 26-year-old David Malcolm hailed from Connecticut and was living in Ithaca, New York while enrolled at Cornell University. According to Nina Miller, one of his co-workers, the sheer gentleness of the man made him very special. He also had a wonderful sense of humor. He was the best of what young people can be. He was idealistic, sensitive, warm, very bright. David has also been described by others as being wise beyond his years and a good role model. David dedicated much of his time to helping others. He worked at a Red Cross emergency shelter and at a suicide prevention network. On February 11, 1987, David worked a 24-hour shift at the Red Cross shelter, which was located on West Ford Street in Ithaca. On the morning of February 12th, his body was discovered in the shelter's office. He had been stabbed to death. Police initially suspected that David had been murdered by one of his co-workers and focused their investigation on this man for years. The case was investigated throughout 1987 and 1988 and then periodically up until 2010. The case was formally reopened in 2015 in hopes of using forensic science to solve it. The Ithaca Police Department worked with the New York State Police Troop C Major Crimes Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Identification Unit, the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center, and the Tompkins County District Attorney's Office in the renewed effort. Following years of work, on May 26, 2023, the Ithaca Police Department announced that, based on DNA evidence and other investigative efforts, they had identified the individual they believed was responsible for the murder of David Malcolm. However, they are choosing not to reveal his name to the public because he cannot be charged with the murder. He died in 2019. The exact source of the DNA that tied him to the murder was also not disclosed. According to investigators, David was killed by the boyfriend of a young woman who had come into the shelter where David worked for help. On February 11, 1987, a teenage girl from the town of Newfield came to the shelter following an altercation with her boyfriend looking for assistance in being relocated somewhere away from him. Investigators believe that the deceased suspect came into the shelter looking for the young girl, and David refused to reveal where she was. According to the press release from the Ithaca Police, Mr. Malcolm's heroic actions for not disclosing the whereabouts of the young teen sadly cost him his life. Investigators from the Ithaca Police Department, Tompkins County District Attorney Matthew Van Houten, and Deputy Chief Vincent Monticello all met with David's family prior to the announcement that the case had been solved. They apologized for the fact that the case took 36 years to solve, attributing the family's long wait for answers to limited resources and the necessary technology being unavailable to them in 1987. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.